This episode specifically is presented by the Wine and Cheese Place, which has been locally owned and operated since 1982. The Wine and Cheese Place has 5 different St. Louis area locations in Town and Country, Creve Coeur, Kirkwood, Clayton, and their newest location, Spirit Wine and Craft in South City. The Wine and Cheese Place and Spirit and Craft carry 5,000 plus wines, 1,200 beers, 1,000 whiskeys, hundreds of cheeses, and plus a great selection of specialty food and gifts. They support local whenever possible too. If you go into their sections, they always have a Made in STL section. Plus, their staff is educated and they know just about everything you need to know about spirits, wine, and even cheese. So stop into one of their 5 St. Louis area locations, or you can go directly to their website and order online at thewineandcheeseplace.com.
If you want to hear about St. Louis, tune into the Bucket List Show weekly. Hear what Marissa and Luke say. It drops every Wednesday. Got a dope new guest every single week. Buckle up for the ride. Who's it gonna be? Who's on the show today? They rep St. Louis. What to do in the loo on a late night, or maybe what to do on a date night. Yeah, Bucket List has you covered. They know what's going on. What's going on, they'll give you, hey, 18 different things to do, or 19 if you need one more to choose. Yeah, this city is a place we call home. A place we call home, yeah.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode and week of the STL Bucket List Show. I'm your host, Marissa Farrell.
And I'm your other host, Luke Farrell, and this episode is proudly presented by our friends over at the Regional Arts Commission of St. Louis. They are the largest public funder of arts and art programming right here in St. Louis. And if you didn't know, all summer long, there's tons of free activations of live and local art. And there's so many institutions doing great things in St. Louis, thanks to our friends over at the Regional Arts Commission.
Definitely, yeah. Okay.
So on to this week's episode. If you want to do the introduction, you feel free to drink water. Yeah, that's fine. The camera goes back and forth when we talk. Okay.
Yeah, you're good. So get comfortable. We are talking today with Jia Lian Yang from the organization Forward with Ferguson.
Forward Through Ferguson.
It's right here. Yeah. I don't know. I'm jumbling off my words these days. But yes, Forward Through Ferguson. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Marissa and Lucas.
And you are a professional podcaster, if you didn't know. I want, just real quick, tell us, how many episodes have you done through the different podcasts that you've been on? I feel like you've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of episodes.
No, not hundreds. I did 3 seasons with We Live Here podcast, which was through St. Louis Public Radio. It's a podcast about race and class in the St. Louis region. And then I also did probably like 2 seasons with Who Raised You podcast, which is a podcast that uplifts voices of color and also features poets of color here in St. Louis.
Oh, cool.
And I co-founded that with my great friend, poet and educator, Dr. Treasure Shields Redmond.
Wow. So how did you get involved? I mean, we're going to talk about you, just kind of familiarizing with our speaker today, but like, how did you get involved in like that specific content? Like, why was that so important to you to get involved in and have those conversations?
Growing up, I really loved the radio. I think it was always on in my mom's car whenever we went anywhere. It was on NPR. I think she was trying to practice her English. And then when I was doing homework, I loved to listen to music. And I just love that kind of chit chat that the hosts have prior to that. And I think there's something about audio storytelling that really captivates a person, ignites their imagination. And I think sometimes right now we're in a very visual time. I think video is almost king in a lot of places and for the algorithm. And I think it can be a little bit distracting. I love video as much as the next person, but there's something about audio where you really have to pay attention and listen. And so that's something I love. And then as far as podcasting, it really started in the aftermath of the Ferguson uprising, which I experienced when I was in graduate school. So I came to St. Louis from California to study social work and divinity. I got 2 graduate degrees, and it was in the midst of that graduate studies that the Ferguson uprising happened. And so I was surrounded by a lot of like clergy people, as well as people who were change makers during that time, just trying to figure out what to do as far as in the region in terms of change that needed to happen. And I really connected with the creatives there. I think the media really painted one picture of what was happening with the Ferguson uprising, but the reality that I saw on the ground was very different. There were so many organizers who were opening up spaces, safer spaces for people to gather for protest. There were people like a group called Justice Beats that used drumming and music to get people excited. Any sort of protest that you go to, there are chants that get people kind of connected of one accord. And so there's something about audio as well as artists here in St. Louis that I think are really sparking change.
Amazing. For
That's
sure.
inspiring.
Oh, we see it all the time, especially like just with many of the guests we've had on before. So what year did you move here? Was it 2014 when you came? And
it was actually 2012. So
Okay.
I've been here for a couple of years. I think St. Louis was really where I started to understand community as well as how race works in U.S. America. I grew up in a very Asian American, essentially what sociologists call ethnoburb. So the majority of folks in my suburb were Asian and Asian American. So it wasn't until I got here where I was like, oh, wow, this is how things work in America. So it was very kind of black and white, but at the same time, I also learned that actually St. Louis has some of the highest rates of immigration, specifically the International Institute placing a lot of people. There's a lot of Bosnians here in St. Louis. So I think something that really strikes me about St. Louis is that the longer you live here, the more you understand the nuances of people and how they relate to each other.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. So what university did you go to when you moved here?
So I went to the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis for my Master of Social Work, and then Eden Theological Seminary, which is a more progressive United Church of Christ type of seminary out in Webster Groves for my Master of Divinity.
So you kind of mentioned it briefly, but when you moved here, you kind of had a culture shock a little bit. So where are you from originally? And then like tell us about that difference of when you actually moved here and like how you had to adjust to that, because you were at WashU, the Brown School, so you probably did have a lot of students that you could relate to, but at the same time, like it's just, I don't know, maybe not, just let us know a little bit about that.
That's a great question. So I grew up in West San Jose in the heart of Silicon Valley. A lot of my friends' parents were engineers. My dad was an engineer, but he kind of got laid off and, on and off during my childhood. And so there was an aspect of financial insecurity when I was growing up. And so I think that was probably some of the reasons why I always kind of gravitated a little bit towards social work or thinking about folks who are more marginalized or not really supported by kind of larger systems.
Right.
I think in America, it's essentially like you need to have this particular job, you need to have these identities in order to succeed. I think there's a lot of conversations about merit nowadays, and I think that is something that is kind of a myth. People talk about it, but at the same time, there is definitely a structure in our country about who has privileges and who doesn't, as far as like politics, education, healthcare, anything, you name it. So coming here, the cultural makeup definitely was different. In the university setting, my high schools were really, like I said, majority Asian American, mostly East Asian, some South Asian. And so that is, I think, something that sometimes I miss as far as language and understanding of culture. But at the same time, I think there's so much richness in St. Louis around various cultures as well, particularly, like I mentioned, with the Ferguson uprising, when people were coming together for direct actions or for community meetings, I was really starting to learn how Black organizing worked. I remember being part of a group that went to Detroit to learn from people there. There was the Allied Media Conference, which is a really amazing conference in Detroit, and we stayed at the home of Baba Blair, who was a Black Panther. And I remember that he would just go throughout the neighborhood and everyone seemed to know him. And, he knew the person at the kind of community-oriented laundromat. He knew urban gardeners. He knew people who had their own kind of like T-shirt business, people who were making kind of leather jewelry, and everyone who's trying to like make things work, and they were so tight-knit. And I remember thinking at that time that it really reminded me of St. Louis. So I think, St. Louis has that same feel of like some families go back here for generations and generations since the Great Migration. And there's some people who, their grandparents even know the street name and it's the same from when they grew up. And there's a saying that people say over and over again here, which is we keep us safe, as in they rely on their communities to keep themselves safe when sometimes the mainstream structures that are out there, for example, the public safety system, which relies on an arrest and incarcerate model, like fails them. And I think that's something we could all learn from.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, I agree with that. So let's talk about the work you're doing now. You have this amazing backstory, and then it's really inspiring, what led you here. And then 2014 happened, and you got to see that. So how soon after that were you drawn in? Tell us about the origin of the organization and stuff like that, and the work that you do now, because you're a storyteller, creative.
Been here for 11 years
I
now,
mean,
you know.
Yeah,
so.
that's a long time now. It's crazy. 11.
Are you here to stay?
That's a great question. I love St. Louis, and I think the decisions that you make around what you call home really comes down to the love that you have for the people, at least for me. Some people are like, oh, I need to go where the scenery is this way, or the environment is this way, or the jobs are this. For me, I really love a lot of people in St. Louis, and so that's part of the reason why I stay.
Awesome.
So as far as being involved with Forward Through Ferguson, I've been on staff for now maybe 2 years. And as far as knowing about Forward Through Ferguson, a lot of my colleagues in social work know about Forward Through Ferguson because of the origins with the Ferguson Commission. So if people don't know, the Ferguson Commission was formed after the killing of Michael Brown Jr., after the Ferguson uprising. It was appointed by the governor, and it was a bunch of people who came together in order to find the root causes of what happened to cause the Ferguson uprising and how to essentially avoid that level of kind of turmoil in the region again. So understanding that really at the root of it is racial equity. So our region notoriously does not have racial equity. It is not a reality here. One of the tools that Forward Through Ferguson later came out with is called Equity Indicators, which is a collaborative project. And that essentially grades various areas in the region from 1 to 100, 100 meaning we've reached racial equity. And one of the areas that we have the lowest score is actually child well-being. And that's something that's very tragic, very sad. For example, as far as equity indicators, it looks at the differences between white people and Black people in terms of outcomes. And so, for example, when you think of a white child, they're way less likely than a Black child to end up in the ER for something like asthma. And so that really tells you about who's disproportionately impacted by air pollution here in St. Louis. Same with lead poisoning. That is something that really impacts children as well. Then you have outcomes as far as education and things like that. All of that combines to we have a very bleak outcome for Black children here in the St. Louis region, and that's something we need to fix. So when I was in social work school, that was something we learned a lot about, all of these kind of inequities ranging from health to education to the justice system. Fast forward to now with Forward Through Ferguson, that it's kind of similar work that we have. Essentially, the nonprofit exists to make sure that the 189 calls to action that the Ferguson Commission named that can get the St. Louis region towards racial equity don't get forgotten. So we convene accountable bodies. We also center impacted communities to do that work. So we are continuing to embrace the Ferguson Commission's mandate to work towards racial equity here in St. Louis.
So when it comes to understanding and pulling that data, like all of those things you just gave us of like where you're seeing these inequities, how do you guys collect that data? Where does that all come from?
That's a great question. So we've previously had some really talented and brilliant data and researchers who are involved with that. And so we've done a number of projects. Some of our big projects include Still Unequal, which is about educational inequity in St. Louis and thinking about how can we get to a more equitable place as far as who can access calculus classes, who has access to arts classes, what is happening as far as the ratios of teachers to students. That's something that report looked at. And there was also a video that won a Telly Award that shared a metaphor about a river. And the reason why we shared that metaphor is because so often when we look at outcomes as far as what a child is doing in school, are they behaving poorly or how are they testing, that is downstream. And what we want to look at as a systems change organization is what are the upstream factors. So one example of an upstream factor is the foundation formula here in Missouri. So that is basically a calculation that is done to determine how much funding each school gets. And as you know, it's tied to property taxes. And then you go back and it's like, well, what influences property taxes? Segregation and redlining. And so a lot of these decisions that were made decades ago are still impacting our children today, are still impacting families, are still impacting our economy and real people's lives. So, you know, Transforming 911 is another major project like that, and I'm really excited to tell you about it.
Yes, that's
So
cool.
before we get into Transforming 911, I want to learn a little bit more about the impact that you guys have had. Let's just say in 2022. I know we talked about it briefly. So really just looking at some of the stats and some of the impact that you guys experienced in 2022, just to kind of give our listeners an idea of really the work that your team is doing, your team and the people in the community.
So just last year, we released the Transforming 911 Advocacy and Accountability Tool, basically a bunch of data and research, storytelling, action items, and we were able to release that through 3 town halls. We shared this original data and research. For the first time, we actually know why St. Louisans call 911 and what that means for policy and budgeting decisions. So we also had action items as far as recommendations for consolidating the 911 system, for updating it so it's not so outdated and relying on landlines, and also advocating for non-police first responder alternatives, which are programs that exist across the country. So we built momentum towards that first kind of 911 integrated civilian first responder pilot in the region. We convened an advocacy coalition, and we also engaged community members on that issue. We also presented at a national conference called Facing Race in Phoenix, Arizona. We were able to educate 45 racial equity leaders from across the country about how to build racial equity capacity in their organizations. And then we also grew the racial equity capacity, anti-racism skills, and action plans for 200 plus community advocates at anchor institutions, biotech and STEM companies, local philanthropic foundations, and others. So if any organization is out there and has a statement that says, okay, DEI is important to us, diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to us, we believe in racial equity, but they don't really have a plan to do that, Forward Through Ferguson is a great resource to make that happen. And then we also supported the Community Governance Board of the Racial Healing and Justice Fund in approving and awarding one-time emergency grant response funding of $16,000 to 5 organizations that offer on-the-ground trauma response in response to gun violence in the St. Louis region. So as you might remember, last year, unfortunately, Central Visual and Performing Arts High School and the Collegiate Medical and Bioscience School, they experienced a school shooting. And so we were able to immediately connect with people that we had relationships with and said, we want to resource you for the work that you're already doing in healing and justice.
Wow.
That's coming up on 1 year.
That's coming up
as
on
well.
1 year.
So I'm an educator. I'm a teacher in the Parkway School District. So just all of this that you're saying about education and how all of these decisions made impact just kids and families now, I'm like, it's just blowing my mind.
Great job on all the work that you guys do.
Really.
Sometimes it's hard to like step back and look and read that list and be like, wow, we did a lot of good stuff last year, you know. And
we definitely move very fast. It is hard to celebrate the wins when that happens, but thankfully we have community, and you know, as the communications director, I do send out newsletters. I work with the new communications catalyst to update social media, and that's something that we are excited to tell people about.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you mentioned Transforming 911. You gave us, you know, the book fresh off the press. I think we might be the first one with it, or probably not. But so tell us about this. I haven't got a chance to look through it yet, but tell us what this means to you guys and what kind of resource this is to the community.
Yeah, so this is the printed copy of the Transforming 911 full report. Okay. It came out in June 2023. So these particular ones have not been touched by anyone else but me.
And us.
Yeah, right, exactly. And now you. There is a digital copy online that you can access at transforming911.org. But essentially, this is a full report of original data and research about why St. Louisans call 911 and what that means for policy and budgeting decisions. It also looks at the 911 landscape and explains what happens on the other line when you call 911. Yeah. It also pays attention to what we're investing in right now, which is our current arrest and incarcerate system, which is, when we look at the needs of St. Louisans, pretty limited, actually, when you think about why people are actually calling for help.
Wow. Yeah, this is well done.
Yeah,
This
so
is
what
great.
you're paging through for people who can't see what's happening
Yeah,
right
I'm
now.
looking
Yeah,
through it right
is
now.
that-
That's why we're quiet. I'm reading.
Yeah, so it's actually a very long resource. It's over 70 pages, but don't let that daunt you. Basically, the beginning part is really our top findings. There's a little bit of an introduction, and then there's top findings. So for people who are like, I can't read a whole report, but I'll look at the snippet, or maybe I have a meeting with an elected person, my alder person, or someone in Jefferson City, and I can just flip immediately to these top findings. And then after that, we have action steps. Those are the top recommendations that we have based on this original evidence, kind of original data and research. And then further in, you kind of look at the history of 911. A lot of people might not know that 911 as we know it wasn't it didn't take shape until the 1960s. And that was in response to suppressing the civil rights uprisings of Black and brown people. And so when we think about the origins of 911 and where it is now, it's no wonder that 911 sometimes actually operates more like a customer service line, where the customer is a very specific demographic. And sometimes white people unfortunately use 911 to call in the mere presence of a Black person in their neighborhood that they think so-called doesn't belong. And so there's all sorts of stories that happen in the media around that. And I don't need to name those for you, but it does have devastating consequences.
Yeah, and I noticed just briefly flipping through the pages that you guys do a lot of collaboration. I see Humans of St. Louis on here, which Lindy was on our podcast probably about a couple months ago, and they do great work themselves. So tell us about the collaboration aspect, because as an organization in St. Louis, even though you are Forward Through Ferguson, you're helping the entire greater St. Louis, metro. So how do you guys lean on collaboration, and you as the communications, like how can you leverage those relationships with other community members to really actually get your mission forward?
Collaboration is actually one of my favorite things about this work.
Yeah.
Prior to Forward Through Ferguson, I was at an art museum as their public programs manager. And that was also a really fun, delightful time for me because I love working with creatives. A lot of people don't know that St. Louis has some of the most brilliant artists. And so with Forward Through Ferguson, actually our origins in the Ferguson Commission, they did work with Humans of St. Louis to share the stories of real St. Louisans and how racial equity or inequity impacts them. And so part of that was the thinking that they didn't want the Ferguson Commission report to be just like any old report that sits on a shelf and gets dusty and is never used. They wanted it to be a living, breathing document that people would use and educate themselves on and then take action. And so you can present people with a bunch of data and research about the realities of racism and racial inequities, but it's not until people realize that it's impacting a person, their daily lives, maybe their neighbor, maybe someone who works at a school that's nearby, or someone who's, at the same coffee shop that they go to, something relatable. That's where people really start to care. So we really use kind of empathy to be a catalyst for change. In the Transforming 911 report, that was something I thought about as well, thinking about what are people's 911 stories, because everyone actually has one. And what's really interesting talking to the Humans of St. Louis team, for some people, I introduced them to someone and said, hey, they have a 911 story that you might want to think about. But for others, they actually went out on the streets. They went to, Forest Park. They went to the Foundry. They went to Old North and met up with people and asked them, what is your 911 story? And sometimes they found that they actually had to talk a little bit more about 911 and what they were trying to do and sharing that information in order to get people to start thinking. Because sometimes people would say, oh, I don't have one. But then they'd start talking about 911 and they'd be like, oh, actually, there was this one time.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's really interesting and can connect all of us in this issue.
Yeah. Even if it's not a direct, something that directly happened to them, but like even something that they witnessed, that they needed to call 911 or something, that's a story. Because again, that shows your environment, what's happening in your community. And something you've been talking a lot about is community and being a reflection. And so how can people who might not be knowledgeable of some of this stuff get involved in what you guys are doing? Like, I know you talked about people who might not even be trained with to handle emergencies and stuff like that. So what opportunities do you have for the common folk to get involved in the organization?
That's a great question. So there is a whole set of things that people can do to get involved with transforming 911 specifically, and there's other ways to get involved with Forward Through Ferguson as a whole. So we do our work in various ways. Some of those ways are through storytelling. So really actually sharing your story about how racial equity matters to you, or what your 911 story might be, is a way that you can get involved. Another way that we do our work is through policy and advocacy. So if there's a particular issue that you're really passionate about, so whether it's around educational equity, or if you want to transform the public safety system, or even if you're not sure if you want to transform the public safety system, but you needed help and you call 911 and you were put on hold, or there was a delay, or they hung up on you, and you're like, that doesn't seem quite right. I know that the dispatchers are maybe doing their best, but I think we need a better system. You can get involved. We will be convening a first responder coalition, and work towards a non-police first responder programs here in St. Louis. So that's one way to do it. We can also be speakers for people. A lot of universities or school groups or faith groups or action groups or even neighborhood groups invite us to speak, either about racial equity as a whole, or Forward Through Ferguson's work, or specifically about transforming 911. There's also something that we're really excited about, which is the Racial Healing and Justice Fund. So that's an area where we are resourcing Black and Brown organizations that do healing and justice work, and we are making sure that they are funded for the work that they're doing. So if you are part of a company or an institution that has resources to give, you can be a sponsor of the Racial Healing and Justice Fund. And if you are an organization that needs funding, we are actually working towards an endowed racial equity fund. So the Racial Healing and Justice Fund has now just concluded, or is concluding its third cycle, and we're going to announce the grantees very soon. So we're very excited about that. But one of the challenges too is really, if you look online, there's this report called Mismatched, and it's this report about inequities in philanthropy. And what they found is that as far as organizations that are funded for racial equity and racial justice work, it's like 1%. It's like very, very small compared to the vast majority of funding that exists out there for nonprofits. And so it's really challenging because we have a community governance board made up of residents from across the St. Louis region who make decisions about who should be funded. And honestly, they want to fund all of the projects that come in. Almost all of the projects they think, wow, this deserves consideration. But unfortunately, they can't because there is limited resources. So we're hoping that with an endowed racial equity fund, more money can be put towards Black and Brown organizations that are doing healing and justice work, and so we don't have to make those hard decisions about who deserves to be funded and who doesn't, because frankly a lot more organizations deserve to be funded than can receive the funds at this point.
And then I wanted to touch on one of the first things that you mentioned was telling your story. How do people do that? Like, do you guys have a form on the website? Is there like a line to call and just say, this is my experience? How do people do that?
So there is actually a form, which is share your 911 story, and you can go to transforming911.org/take action, and there's all those actions there. So that's one way to do it, but I'm also very reachable. My email is Jia, J-I-A, at forwardthroughferguson.org. Again, that's J-I-A at forwardthroughferguson.org, and you just shoot me an email. Say, hey, I have a story to share with you, and send me a brief description about what it is that you want to share, and we'll talk about how that could be used or how you can kind of get your story elevated.
Amazing.
That's incredible. So I got one more question, then we'll get to the bucket list question, which I know all your friends and family that are listening are waiting to hear your STL bucket list. You've been working on it, but just tell us about, you mentioned the endowment fund and all that, but what other major goals do you guys have going into 2024 that you can share with us, or some that you might not be able to share with us? But just tell us about some of those major goals that your organization's looking to kind of crush going into the next year.
I love that word crush. Like we're gonna be really
crushing goals,
strong about it.
That's what we do. We crush
Make
goals.
it happen.
Right. So we are really excited to announce at some point that we will have a new executive director. So Our former executive director is David Dwight IV. We recently held this amazing legacy fundraiser for him, just honoring his 8 years of service to the organization. He was very passionate, had so much kind of excitement about what the St. Louis region can do as far as racial equity, and so many people came together, which was such a testament to the fact that we do not do this work alone. And we're looking forward to whoever our next kind of leader is for the organization. And I say kind of leader because we're very non-hierarchical with our organization. We try to do things in kind of less traditional ways. So we actually have been meeting for close to, a year, half a year about our new strategic plan. So a lot of that is thinking about how do you take an organization that is, since 2016 to now, basically a startup organization, very scrappy. At some point, there were only 2 full-time staff, and now we're growing and we have more staff than we've had before. And how do you get that to be an established institution? And so that's a really difficult kind of growing point for nonprofits. And at the same time, we believe that because racial equity should be a priority in this region, we should have the resources to do the work that we're doing, and we should be able to have the people with the talent and skills to make that happen. There are so many people who are passionate about racial equity. I'm sure you can think of people in your own life who are like, I had to take this other job just because it pays the bills. Wouldn't it be nice if you could pay the bills and also work towards racial equity? And wouldn't it be nice if more of that work was resourced? That's our thinking anyway.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, you guys will crush those goals.
Yes.
So it is the STL Bucket List Show. I know you're not from St. Louis, but you've been here long enough to have a bucket list in this town. So tell us about, if you were, let's position it this way. Let's say a friend came in town to come see you. Where are some of the places you're going to take them? What are some of the restaurants, some of the parks? Like, just tell us about a bucket list.
Your favorite things to do.
Yeah. So I think I'll give you some broad categories, but I'll start with really the first thing that popped into my mind, which I think is maybe a little bit unexpected. As far as a uniquely St. Louis experience, I actually would recommend that people, if this is something that could be a fit for them, participate in a protest or a direct action. And I say that because that was one of the things that really helped me to fall in love with St. Louis, fall in love with the people here, fall in love with the energy that's here for change. If you've been here for a long time and you care about racial equity, or you care about living in a society where everyone has what they need to live and thrive, you probably have either kept in touch, learned about a protest or direct action, or were part of one. There's something about a protest or direct action that really bonds you to the people that you're around. You might kind of understand why people care so much about this region. But there's also music in protest and direct action. There's jokes, there's humor. There's also a sense of purpose about what people are asking for. So, we just emerged out of a pandemic, and there were protests around making sure that people had access to housing, making sure that people who are unhoused were not evicted, making sure that people have what they need as far as access to testing and things like that. There are so many causes that people can be passionate about here in St. Louis, and I think people sometimes might have just one view of what a protest or a direct action is. I was part of a direct action where people were putting on street theater. That is so fun. Like, protest and direct action can be really creative and inspiring. But
That's
as far
a bucket list experience.
Yeah,
It's
it's definitely a bucket list experience. For the other things, I think St. Louis has amazing nature. People sometimes think, oh, it's flat, that's all there is. Well, there's greenways. There's incredible networks of trails that you can bike, walk, play. And there's also urban farms. There's amazing Black-led, Black-owned urban farms in St. Louis that I urge people to check out. There's also a really wonderful food scene. So, there's food as far as kind of Black-owned restaurants. And there's also music. There's so much music. Some of our really talented artists do multiple things. So there's Damon Davis, who is both a musician, but he also made an installation downtown of Mill Creek Valley, which is an old Black neighborhood, which is no longer around, but the descendants are still there. You can pick up a book from Vivian Gibson about the history of Mill Creek Valley. Maybe you can catch a tour from Tan Taylor and Dr. Treasure Shields Redmond about the history of East St. Louis. Learn about the home of Miles Davis out in East St. Louis. You could eat something at Simply Delicious downtown and get some really sticky fried chicken. There's really a lot of things in St. Louis. I can't say enough. Teatopia is a Black-owned tea restaurant that I'm very addicted to their blueberry smoothies because it's just so smooth and great for the summer.
There. That's so good.
Yeah, really good.
Teatopia is a cute spot. What about, so you said Simply Delicious. Like, what about like another restaurant? What's like another hot spot that you like to visit?
Fritanga is one of my favorite restaurants. It's Nicaraguan, and I've never had something bad there. I just had a birthday there, and my guest list kept growing, and they were just like, add another table, add another table.
Yeah, that's rare.
Super
really
accommodating.
That's rare sometimes. They're like, wait, one more person's
plantain,
coming?
Maduros are
plantain.
delicious.
Oof, that's so good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast with us today. I think we learned a lot about your guys' mission, but also just a little bit about yourself too. So I'm glad we got to talk about you and kind of what drew you to the organization. If you want to leave our guests with anything, some social tags where they can find you on the website, and then any final words, just go ahead and we can wrap it up.
Yeah, you can follow Forward Through Ferguson at STL Change on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. If we ever get to Threads or Mastodon, it'll probably also be STL Change.
Nice.
We also have a Medium blog where we put some of our thoughts, and so that exists out there. You could just search Forward Through Ferguson. Our website is at forwardthroughferguson.org, and I really urge you to check out Transforming 911 at transforming911.org.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Jia. You did amazing. I mean, so informative. And again, guys, make sure you're going out. You are supporting, you're getting involved. You are just learning new things about what you can do to help out the community. So thank you so much.
See you guys next week.
Today they rep St. Louis, yeah. They rep St. Louis. They rep St. Louis.